Awesome. Hey, Ref students, what is up, guys? Doing pretty good. A lot of new faces here tonight, or people I haven't seen in a while. It's always exciting to see all of you guys here. Man, and I am excited. We are in week 2 of a series we started last week. Maybe anyone off the top of their head can tell me what the name of it's called? Anyone? Any guesses? You guys must have Blue's Clues level detective skills to figure that out. You pulled out your handy dandy notebook, followed the pictures, and navigated straight to discovering where we're at. Yeah, we're in a series called Wrecked, going through the life of Paul. And last week, if you weren't with us, we talked about the kind of beginning of his story. At this time, people were still calling him Saul, and he was not a very good dude. He was actually going around killing Christians, was a persecutor of the church, going after people who were following God, and just not like a guy you'd be wanting to bring into this place because he would not be a big fan of what we were doing here. Yet, while he was on a road to this place called Damascus, with papers in his hand giving him the right to put anyone that was saying they were following Jesus in prison, he met Jesus himself on that road, and it changed his life forever. And so in last week we had talked about how no matter what you've done, no matter what your story is, and we talked a lot about our stories, that Jesus is better at saving than you are at sinning. And we're actually today probably will be the only week that will feel like this, but we're going to pick up right where we left off in the book of Acts. Right where we left off last week. So I'm going to jump right in, and then we're going to get to where we're going today. So if you have a Bible with you, I'd love for you to turn there. We do have some Bibles in the seats. I'd love for you to join us. We're going to be in Acts chapter 9, verse 8. And it says, Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight. He neither ate nor drank. And so like I was saying last week, we talked about the kind of origin, beginning story of this guy named Saul, the Christian killer, the persecutor. We saw him at the stoning of the first Christian martyr, where they threw rocks at this guy till he died simply for being a Jesus follower and telling people about who Jesus is and what he did. And Saul was the guy that as they were getting their stones ready, he was holding everyone's coat so that they would have full arm strength to throw their rocks. And that's who he is. It said he was a persecutor of the church. He was a violent man. He was doing all of these things. Yet he was exactly the type of person that Jesus was going after, regardless of his resistance, regardless of the things going on. And he met Jesus. Jesus blinded him on a road and said, Saul, you are persecuting me. And he realized in that moment that Jesus was the God that he had been waiting for, that Jesus was the Savior he had been waiting for, and that he had been persecuting the very person he had been hoping and waiting for his entire life. And so we find him now, it says, his friends that he were with carried him to Damascus. He hasn't eaten for 3 days. He hasn't drank water for 3 days. He's still blinded. And we pick up the story because God begins talking to this other person named Ananias. And he comes to him in a vision. We'll pick up in verse 11. It says, And the Lord said to him being Ananias, Rise and go to the street called Straight. And at the house of Judas, look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. He has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has the authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. I want you for a second to put yourself in Ananias' part of the story. And so often, I tell you, put your thinking caps on. You guys know what to do. Put your thinking caps on. I want you to put yourself in this guy's story, in this guy's situation. He is a Christian guy following Jesus in a culture that is anti-Jesus. And God comes to him and says, hey, I have someone I need you to go see. It's super important. I need you to go see this guy. And the guy that I want you to go see, you've heard rumors about. You've heard stories about. There's a reputation about him as someone who not is only against Christ, but is violent, has killed Christians. And not only that, in his hands right now is papers that would give him the right to put you in prison just for saying you're a Jesus follower. And Jesus is like, yeah, that's the guy. That's the guy that I'm sending you to go to. And so maybe like you're kind of, if you're getting into his story, you can feel his resistance a little bit. And he's like, God, I've heard some things about this guy, right? Like I've heard some stories. I've heard what's been going on, what's been said about him. And I'm a little worried about the guy that you're sending me to go see. You know, there's a good chance that Saul was a part of the imprisonment or even the death of people that Ananias knew, maybe even people in his family because of his persecution of the church. And he's saying, hey, I've heard of Saul the killer. I've heard of Saul the imprisoner. I've heard of Saul the persecutor. And I love how God describes Saul in this situation. He says, hey, you're going to go to this place and you're going to find a man named Saul, and he is going to be praying. You see, Ananias had heard about Saul the accuser. He'd heard about Saul the executioner. He had heard about Saul the persecutor, but he had not heard about Saul the prayer yet. And everything was about to change. The story picks up in verse 15. It says, but the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. So Ananias departed and entered the house. Laying his hands on him, he said, brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes. He regained his sight, and then he rose and was baptized. And taking food, he was strengthened. You know, just a minute ago, we put ourselves in Ananias' situation. I want you to think for a minute about Paul's situation. Paul was on his way to go kill Christians, and then he meets Jesus, and his life is changed forever. You might think negatively at first. He's blinded, he's hungry, he hasn't had anything to drink, but his life has been completely changed. And he's sitting there and he's praying, and God has told him, he said, Paul has gotten a vision that a man named Ananias is going to come and is going to come greet him and is going to come restore him, restore his sight. And I begin to wonder what Paul is thinking. Maybe Paul is worried that maybe he has imprisoned someone that Ananias knew. Maybe he has been a part of the execution of someone that Ananias cared for. What if Ananias had wanted to have no part of Saul, the Christian killer? What if Ananias didn't want to have any part of Saul, the persecutor, Saul, the imprisoner? What if all Ananias saw when he looked at him was his past, his mistakes, who he was before he came to know Jesus? And yet, when he greets him, I doubt the first words he expected to hear was brother Saul. You see, in the moment where he was probably expecting judgment, in the moment where he was probably expecting condemnation, in the moment where he was probably expecting not to be welcome, he was greeted as a brother. I bet that was the one situation that hadn't crossed through his mind. And I often think about you guys and the situations and the people you find yourself around, the people you go to school with, the people that sit in your classrooms, the people you ride your bus with, the people who are on your teams, the people who you live in the same neighborhood as. And I often wonder if God was working on their heart and God was beginning to change their lives, and God sent you to go to them, do they think they would be greeted as a brother or as an enemy? How would they feel that you would approach them? Maybe just like Saul, God has begun to work on the hearts of the people he has put around you. And he has begun to work on their hearts and draw them to them. And maybe they are in a place where they feel broken, hungry, starved, and they're praying that God would show up and God would do something, and God is sending you. You know, we have we say a lot, you belong. We have t-shirts that say it. We have wristbands we've given you that say you belong. We want this to be a place that people feel like they can belong to, that this is a safe place, that this is a place that they are known, that this is a place that they are loved. Do the people that God has put around you feel like they belong based off the way that you talk about them, based off the way that you treat them, based off of the way that you interact with them? Are they greeted as a brother or a sister, or are they greeted as an enemy? And maybe you're like Ananias and you're like, listen, you haven't heard what I've heard about them. You don't know the rumors. You don't know what I know about them. We don't want them. Man, the crazy and amazing thing about this story is that through a simple act of obedience, and listen, here's the thing. You look at Ananias and this isn't his first choice, right? Ananias isn't like, oh, Saul, the Christian killer, Saul, this guy I've heard the stuff about, Saul, this guy that probably doesn't fit very socially in our club. That's the guy that you want me to go bring in. Yet God tells him to go, and in an act of obedience, he greets the person that should be his greatest enemy as someone who's a part of his family, and he calls him a brother. And maybe you don't think that's a big deal, but I just have to wonder, what if that wasn't Paul's story? What if Ananias chose not to go? How would that have changed everything? What if Ananias wasn't obedient? What if Ananias said, hey, we don't want them? Hey, I know what they're about, and I don't want anything to do with that. Maybe you're up to something, maybe you're not. But I'm not going to bring them in. They don't belong here. Man, I just wonder, the people that God has put around in your life, maybe the way that you've treated them, maybe the way that you've judged them, maybe the things that you've said to them or you've said about them would make them feel like this is not a place that they belong. And you are missing out on God using you to do amazing things. And maybe you're like, how is just going and welcoming someone a big thing? If you're taking notes, here's my first point for you. God works supernatural movements in seemingly natural moments. God works supernatural movements in seemingly natural moments. It seems like a very natural moment for Ananias to go to Saul and greet him as a brother. Yet in that moment, God is up to something. God is working. God is doing something. And it's not only changing Ananias' life. It's not only changing Paul's life. It's changing so many people's life that they haven't even encountered yet. The fact that we are sitting in a room talking about their story life right now means that it mattered. Talking about what happened now means that it was important, that God was up to something. And your life is full of seemingly natural moments. When you ride the bus, when you play video games, when you practice when you're with your teammates, when you sit at a dinner table, your life is full of seemingly natural moments that God can use to do supernaturally amazing things as we're obedient to the things that he's called us to and the way he's called us to be. Man, and like I said, I just wonder, what would we be talking about today if that wasn't Paul's story? If instead of being greeted as a brother or a sister, he was greeted as an enemy. He was kept at arm's length. They just began to talk about the stories that they knew about him. And listen, make no mistake, Your call might not be as specific as Ananias to go to a specific house and a specific street to go talk to a specific person named Saul, but God has sent you to the streets that you're on, to the school that you're at, to the team that you're on, so that people might belong, so that people might know that they're loved, so that people might know that there's hope, so that people might know that there is this God, the same God that revealed himself to Paul on a road, and the same God that revealed himself to you wherever that was. We talked about your story last week, is available to them at this very moment. And it was the simple act of greeting someone as a friend, as a brother, letting them know that they belong. And in a minute, his life changed. The story picks up in verse 19. It says, "For some days he was with the disciples at Damascus, and immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues, saying, 'He is the Son of God.' And all who heard him were amazed and said, 'Is it not the same man who made havoc in Jerusalem of those who called upon his name? And is he not the same one who came here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priest?' And it says, 'But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ.'" Saul shows up on his way to Damascus, is blinded, and for a few days, about 3 days, he hasn't eaten, he hasn't drank any water, he hasn't seen. And the simple act of someone welcoming in, someone embracing him as a brother, someone letting him know that he belongs, that's the moment that God used to open his eyes, to restore him. And then moments later, we see him teaching people about who God is, saying he is the Son of God. And not only just telling people about it, but convincing them about it, right? Homeboy's been a believer for a few days, and he's already telling people about Jesus, and people are coming to know him. And he's only believed this for just a few days. God is already using him. God is already up to something. And just a few days, some good food. He probably had some ramen noodles, right? Maybe he stopped by at the local Taco Bell in Damascus and, got him a Baja Blast Mountain Dew. And after the sustenance that he needed, he just begins telling people about what God has done in life. He begins telling people his story. And people's lives are being changed one after another, forever. A few days ago, Paul was convinced that all of the Christians needed to die. He was on his way with written papers that was giving him permission to not only imprison people, but to kill them just for being a Christian. And now he is convinced and convincing others that Christ died and Christ rose again. Man, everything's changed. Later in the book of Galatians, he kind of is telling his own origin story. You guys know what I mean by origin story, right? Like, superhero movies have well-known origin stories, like Spider-Man. Like if they made a new Spider-Man movie and casted a new Spider-Man, like there's some things you're going to expect, right? Like he gets bitten by a, right? I know some of you are like, way to ruin it for me, right? He likes a girl named, all right, see, some debate. Godzilla. His uncle tells him, with great power. Yes. So there's some things that his origin story. There's some things that we come to know. Paul begins to say, hey, this is my story. This is how my story got started. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 11, he says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached to me is not man's gospel." He said, "For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through the revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard from my former life in Judaism how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. Paul begins to tell some of the things we know about how his story got started. That he was very influential in the Jewish community, that he was kind of on a fast track to being a very well-known rabbi and a great teacher, and that he was studying under one of the most famous rabbis at that time named Gamaliel. And he begins to tell us all these things about himself, that he was well respected and all of these things. He was passionate, that he was known for persecuting the church. And he's kind of giving us his origin stories. But then there's a but. He said, I was doing all this thing. This is what my life was about. But in one moment, everything changed. He continues in verse 15. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me. You see, it's interesting. It's easy for us to say that Paul's story started when he began killing Christians, or when he began studying Judaism, or Paul's story started when he was on that road to Damascus. But Paul's understanding of his story says, before I was even born, God was up to something. Before I breathed my first breath, God was moving and God was working and God was up to something, and he was pleased to reveal the Son to me. It was his pleasure, it was his joy that I would know Jesus. He says, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. You know, a couple of things I feel like it's good to point out about where Paul is at right now. Like, Paul used to be on the fast track to being a very well-known, influential Jewish rabbi, and then on his way to go kill Christians, he became a Christian. And just after a few days of being a Christian, he's actually already on his way of being an influential, well-known Christian speaker, teacher, and people are becoming saved around him, and people are coming to know Jesus around him. Hey, y'all, pay attention to me. This is important. And all it took was just a moment for that to change. All it took was just a moment for God to show up and do the miracle. He says, but before I was even born, God was chasing after me. Before I was even born, God was up to something, and God was doing something, and God was coming after me. And I saw Jesus, and everything changed. And it would have made sense for him to just keep doing that, right? Like, it would have made sense. He's like, hey, I've come to know Jesus. I'm already teaching people. People are coming to know Jesus. I should just keep on doing this. And then Paul's story says, and then I went to Arabia. And from what we know from Paul's story is he actually left and went to Arabia for about 3 years, and we don't hear from him. On his way to kill Christians, meets Jesus. God sends Ananias to go restore him, begins preaching and teaching. People are getting saved. God is up to something. God is doing something. And then he just disappears for 3 years. Like, that's not the best business plan if you're trying to start something. That's not the best, growth track. Like, if you're trying to grow something, you're trying to do something important, the best thing to do isn't to just disappear for 3 years. Like, that makes sense. You see, but Paul understood something. If you're taking notes, here's my next point for you. Paul got away from everyone to spend time with someone. Paul got away from everyone to spend time with someone. In the midst of God changing his life, in the midst of him, in the infancy of his Christian belief, God using him mightily to save people, to teach people about Jesus, to convince people that he is God, Paul found that there was something more important than all of that. Before he was going to stand on a stage, before he was going to reach the nation, before he was going to write letters, to teach theology about who God is and what he's doing that we're still reading to this day, the most important thing he could do was simply spend time with Jesus. You know, we've been talking about that. If you attend here on Sundays, Pastor Jason talked about this just a few weeks ago, that after the resurrection, Jesus dies. We celebrated Easter a few weeks ago, maybe about a month ago now. It's actually not a few weeks ago. And Jesus rose again, and the believers are out of their minds, like, oh my gosh, it actually happened. All of this stuff is crazy. Jesus is like, hey, you're going to go. You're going to do all this stuff. And then he pumps the brakes and he says, but first, we're getting breakfast, right? He's like, I'm making waffles. And Jesus thought it was more important than getting the head start on his new Christian ministry, more important than it was to reach the nations and send everyone out, was to simply spend time with his family, to spend time with his people. Man, and Paul was so dialed in on that, he actually spent 3 years just spending time with Jesus. It's actually interesting that the apostles, right after Jesus resurrected, died, ascended, left, they had a hole to fill of one of the disciples. There was originally 12 disciples. If you know the story, one of them betrayed the Jesus. He was no longer a disciple after that. They had a tough conversation, said, you're out, all right? You're no longer in the disciple club. And so they were looking to replace someone. And the things that they said, it's like Acts chapter 1. They're like, hey, we want someone who has spent time with Jesus like we have. And they followed Jesus for 3 years, and somehow, supernaturally, Paul was like, hey, you know what? I need to spend some time with Jesus. And for 3 years, Paul sat under Jesus. Paul had breakfast with Jesus. Paul spent time with Jesus. More important than his future ministry, more important than all the people that would be saved, more important than all the books that he would write, was simply the time that he prioritized to spend with his Savior. He said, he was pleased to reveal the Son to me. This is the person I want to spend my time with. This is the person that I want to be around. This is what I want to do. And here's the sad thing. Most of us will never get to experience that. And it's not because we're anti-Jesus. It's not because we hate Jesus. It's not because we're sitting here like, Jesus is the worst person ever. I don't even believe in him. Whatever that is, that's not the reason most people won't experience it. Most people won't experience it because they simply get distracted by all the things around them. They get caught up in doing what's right in front of them, the work that's right in front of them. The sports that they play, the friends that are around them. They get caught up in what's immediate, what's right in front of them, and they miss out on the most important things. One pastor and author, John Ortberg, writes, for many of us, the great danger is not that we will renounce our faith. It is that we will become so distracted and rushed and preoccupied that we will settle for a mediocre version of it. He's like, the greatest danger that we face isn't just that we would become Jesus haters, is that we would get so caught up in things that aren't the most important that we forget about the time to spend with Jesus. That we would remember the God that saved us, that we would remember the one who was pleased to reveal the Son with us, and we would begin to spend time, that we would sit and have breakfast. When Jesus is inviting people to follow him, he gives an invitation. He says, hey, come follow me. All who are burdened and heavy laden, all who are dealing with junk, all who are stressed, all who are anxious, all who are overwhelmed. Maybe you're in here today and you're like, I'm dealing with some stuff. Man, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling all of these things, and I don't know where to go, and I don't know what to do, and I just keep getting caught up into it. And the invitation that Jesus has is to just come and spend some time with him. And the crazy thing is, that's actually where the burden begins to get lighter. That's actually where the anxiety begins to go away. That's actually where we begin to feel less overwhelmed as we spend time with the one who controls all of the things. And his invitation is to come and spend time with me. And listen, God had already told Paul, hey, I have so many things for you in the future. Man, there's going to be suffering that's going to happen to you. There's going to be people that are going to be saved because of you. Churches that are going to be planted. People that are going to be reached. Books that are going to be written. These things are going to happen to you. I've already been working this plan since before you were born. But before Paul could do any of those things, he just needed to spend some time with Jesus. And I don't know what's in the future for you. Like, I don't know what that thing that God might be preparing you for. Like, you might not be someone that's going to be a pastor or stand on a stage or plant a church, but you might start a business that's going to impact your community and do something amazing. I mean, you might be a parent that's going to just invest in their kids and teach them about who Jesus is and raise up the next generation. I mean, you might be a teacher that's going to directly influence kids and students to how they think and how they learn and how they interact. I don't know what God is going to prepare you for. But what I know is what he's preparing you for later starts with the time that you begin spending with him right now. Here's my last point for you. Sometimes before God can do something through you, he has to do something in you. Sometimes before God can do something through you, he has to do something in you. And like I said, I don't know what that is for you. You might not even know what God is beginning to work and was beginning to put on your heart and where he's leading you and what job you'll end up having or who you'll end up marrying or what school you'll end up going to or your career or all of those things that end up happening, where you'll be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. But what he is saying and what we see in Paul's life is it didn't just happen randomly. Like Paul didn't just stumble in on it. Ananias didn't become the person that was able to move past his fears, move past his distrust randomly. He wasn't like, well, I guess I will. No, he had already spent time with Jesus so that when the moment came for his obedience, he was prepared for it. And sometimes before you walk through something, man, and a lot of times it's exciting to think about what God might do in the future. It's exciting to think about what God might do later in life. But if we're not obedient in where he has us right now, we'll never be able to walk where he has us in the future. And so he is inviting you at this very moment not to be more busy, not to do more Christian things, but to simply spend some time with the one who saved you. To spend some time with the one who lived and died for you. To spend some time with the one who's ruling and reigning, and maybe you're worried about what's making you anxious and overwhelmed and all the things going on in your life. And his invitation is, hey, come to me. I'm the one that deals with that. I'm the one who frees you from that. I'm the one who saves you from that. I'm the one that you find rest in. Listen, the reason that Ananias was able to be the type of person that God used to radically change Paul's life, and the reason that God was able to use Paul to radically change so many people's life to the point that we're spending 5 weeks just talking about his life, is because they spent the time with him so that they were able to be used by him later in life. So I don't know where God has you right now. I don't know what's going on right now, but I know if you're not obedient now, you're not going to be obedient later. You're not going to stumble in on it. And so your obedience, the time that you spend with Jesus, the things that he's growing in you now, is what prepares you for where he's going to have you in the future. I love the way Paul kind of describes this in his own life in Philippians chapter 3, verse 7. He says, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. He's like, I had a lot of things going for me, but that wasn't the most important. That wasn't the most valuable. That wasn't the thing I needed to care the most about. He says, indeed, I count everything as loss. Don't miss this, because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. More than my future ministry, more than all the people that are going to be saved, more than all the churches that are going to be planted, more than all the Christian and good and right things I could do. And the most important thing I could do was simply know and spend time with Jesus. And that's what he's inviting you into. He doesn't want you to be more busy. He doesn't want you to do more Christian things. He just wants you to spend time with him. Man, and when that begins to happen, supernatural things, God begins to move and work. Lives begin to get changed. The people that God has put around you begin to feel like they belong and they are welcome and they are known. And maybe right at this very moment, God is working on their heart. And he's waiting for you to be obedient where he has you right now. And he's waiting for you to be the type of person that lets them know that they belong here. But it starts right now. Pray with me.